Welcome everyone to today's webinar for the future of the art market. As you will know, if you registered for the event, today's discussion is about shared infrastructures and how the art market could potentially be facilitating a sharing economy. But before we start the discussion, I want to take a few minutes to go through a bit of housekeeping, some things that you might like to know, and then I will ask our speakers to join me on this virtual stage. So just to run through a few things. The first is that this webinar will be recorded. So please know that if you do need a comfort break or any type of break, you can do so and catch up on the discussion afterwards on the FOTAM microsite. The second thing to note is that live audio captioning can be enabled for this discussion, and that will provide you with closed captions at the bottom of your screen. These captions are facilitated by AI, so they may not always be 100% accurate, but I've tried to feed in a few of the terms that we will be using today to make it more accurate. So please do turn that on if you require. Also, the Creative United team have created a safe space policy. What that means really is that everyone should feel safe to provide their opinion, and that we should use language that is inclusive and makes everyone feel welcome. And they have a bit on their website about it, but I just want to remind you to abide by that and just think about how you would feel if someone was saying that about you. Next, just a bit about the logistics of this Zoom call. As you may notice, the chat has been disabled. It doesn't mean there will be nothing in the chat, but we will be broadcasting things to you, whether that is things that we reference during the discussion, links to interesting websites, or any announcements. Then, if you want to engage with the discussion, just to make it a little bit easier for you, we've enabled the Q&A. So you can ask questions in the Q&A section, and then also comment and upvote on those questions. So we want to see what you think is interesting and important to discuss. And yes, often when both the chat and the Q&A are turned on, questions might be in the chat and that type of thing. So we're keeping it simple. Please engage with us on the Q&A section of Zoom. And these are also being collected by the wonderful curator of this event, Lucy Sollitt, who will be reminding us if there is something that we really need to answer in our discussions. I am reserving 15 minutes at the end of this discussion to discuss all of the questions that are raised. But if we notice something that's really pressing in the meantime, we will deal with them as and when as well. Another thing to note is that there are reading rooms available for everything related to the future of the art market. So if you go to the same website where that I mentioned earlier, so that's fotam.creativeunited.org.uk, you can actually find resources that are interesting to read about the future of the art market, about digital art, about the sharing economy that we might have shared. And anything that's mentioned today will also be shared on that reading room. So feel free to check that out. Maybe the team can share a link to the reading room. Oh, I see they have already done that. And the next thing is a really interesting, cool thing that we're going to be doing after this call. There is something called video lounges. This is a new type of meeting space that has been developed by someone from the art and tech community called Kalani Nicole. I attended the video lounges after the last FOTAM discussion, and I really recommend going. It's a different type of interaction online. It's more informal. It feels more like if you were at a party and you could walk around the room, find out who's talking to each other, join the conversation, just listen in, and maybe jump to another conversation. It's a much more informal way of chatting. And so that link will be shared with you towards the end of this call. And if during this webinar we have a subject that's mentioned that is super interesting, but we could go on for hours about it and we don't want to distract ourselves, we will say, well, maybe you can actually discuss that on the video lounge afterwards. So that's one. Then we do want you to be sharing on social as well. So if you are going to be commenting about today's discussion, you can use the hashtag FOTAMUK, hashtag FOTAMUK. And some people joke that it sounds like FOTAMUK, but it is FOTAMUK. And please tag at Creative United UK, because they'd love to share it as well. And yes, feel free to use the Q&A here, but also use social to discuss what we're discussing here. And so last but not least, I should acknowledge who has made these discussions possible today. These discussions on the future of the art market have been very generously supported by Creative Scotland, Creative United, and University College London, UCL. So without further ado, I would like to ask the fellow panelists for this discussion to join on stage, which means they're going to turn on their video. And the idea is that we will be briefly introducing each of them. Then we are going to be discussing what has been what we have actually gathered over the last few weeks in terms of polling people and finding out the opinions of people about these subjects, and then we will go to the Q&A. So I'm just a quick reminder, my name is Bernadine. I'm the CEO of a company called Vastari. We're headquartered in London, and we help find content for exhibitions worldwide, whether that is loans from private collections or touring exhibitions from different sources. And I was really honored to be asked to bring together a group of speakers today to talk about shared infrastructures. And I wanted to give a bit of context from me about why I invited each person onto this discussion. And then I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and also to share a little bit about how they got into the art world. Because I think that also your step into the art world, the stories behind that is part of the shared infrastructure that we have offline about how you access the art market, the art world. So I'll start with Louise Hamlin. Louise runs a company called Art Market Minds that is very well known for having developed the Art Business Conference. And I know Louise already since quite some time ago when she was at the Art newspaper. But what I found interesting was during 2020, because of course conferences are not really doable right now, she's been thinking about a new venture that also is about sharing. And I think that conferences themselves are about sharing. So Louise, would you like to introduce yourself briefly to everyone?
Sure. Hello, everyone. And thank you, Bernadine, for inviting me today. You're a great champion for these conversations and a fantastic ambassador for the art and tech community. So thank you so much. And thank you to Lucy today for organising and curating this series, and to Creative Scotland, Creative United and UCL. So to offer a short background in terms of where I am today and my history and how I kind of access the art market. Originally, I'm an art history graduate. By training, I studied at the Courtauld Institute of Art and then spent around 15 years working for the commercial team of the Art newspaper. And during that time, we kind of witnessed an unprecedented growth in the global art market. It was a really exciting time. We went, I think, from having 3 different language editions to almost in the space of a year growing and having a Chinese monthly edition, a Russian edition, and also started publishing daily editions for the global art fair scene as well. So it's a really exciting time, really dynamic team of very, very hardworking journalists. And then in 2014, I set up my own business, which is the Art Business Conference. which is a one-day annual conference. Really, I created it as a response to the growth in professionalism across the art market, thinking about things like, in terms of infrastructure, IT, logistics, art law, cross-border transactions, and really the kind of mounting complexities of running an art business or organization. And the concept of the conference is really simple: to share ideas, to share knowledge, and to bring those different sectors within the art community together in terms of galleries, dealers, art advisors, and those providing services to the community. And so the conference grew. We launched in London in 2014, then in New York in 2017, and then in Shanghai in 2018. And then 2020. I have behind me here kind of summarizes the last 6 months, really, for me, and I'm sure for everyone. We're all work from home, and so I think this kind of summarizes where we are. It's been a really interesting time, just really rethinking the conference, the kind of way of sharing knowledge, and is there a way to replicate that online? And so we've created a new platform called Art Mavens. Maven means expert, knowledge, connoisseur. And the idea is that it's a knowledge sharing platform for people to have kind of meaningful exchanges that they might not be able to have in real life, and bring again those sectors of the community of the art world together. And also kind of fostering, hopefully, a better sense of mentorship as well across the industry.
I think it's really interesting, and I really appreciate that you mentioned sharing knowledge, because that was one of the things that inspired me to bring you on board. The fact that you've seen maybe the effects of having one place, one time where everyone can speak to each other, learn from each other. And exactly, it'll be interesting to hear how it's going with your beta of taking that from the offline to the online, and how that experience has been with you. So going from offline to online, next I'd love to introduce Jason Bailey. I've known Jason for a while through the art and tech community, and I specifically really admire his blog Art Gnome for its championship of writing very intelligent and thoughtful articles about the way that data, technology, the art world interacts with each other. And I think that especially if we look at infrastructure, technology is clearly a big part of infrastructure when you want to share things. Even the sharing economy itself, many say that it requires a technological element in order for the sharing economy to reach elements of scale. And so I was really happy when Jason said he could join us today. And it's quite early where you are now, Jason. Could you tell everyone a bit about you and about how you got into the art world?
Sure, yeah, and no problem. I'm an early bird anyway. So thank you for the kind introduction, Bernadine, and for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. I think a lot of times I hear the people complain about the art world as if it's like some council of people that decide what the art world is going to be, but it's really all of us, everybody, right? We all get to decide what this is going to be. So I think a world with more shared infrastructure is important. So background-wise, I grew up an artist in a family of engineers. So I kind of, reference myself as the black sheep of the family. My older brother was an engineer. My younger brother was an engineer. My dad was an engineer. And all I ever wanted to do was be an artist. So I went on to art school and studied art history and studio art. And then when I graduated, I realized, I kind of knew before I graduated, but I realized what most artists realize, which is it's really hard to make a living, if not impossible, as an artist in the world. It's kind of set up in a winner-take-all kind of setup where a very small number of artists do quite well, and then it's very hard for other artists. So I kind of, went back into the family business and worked in tech for the next 20 years, took not so much a break, but went back to school nights and got my MFA in art and tech because I wanted to be around artists. I didn't have any illusions that would somehow help my career either. But it's just, where I wanted to be and what I loved. And then after grad school, I had missed these large projects, big meaty projects where I could really do a lot of research. And I read a book about forgery where I had heard that something like, 15 to 20% of art on the market and in museums is either forged or misattributed. And I know that's an unknowable number and somewhat controversial, but we all know that it's a problem. And I was kind of blown away because I worked, in tech and in big data with these giant databases. And I called around to all the major institutions, Smithsonian and the Getty and, the different universities. And they all said there is no database listing the known works by, all the best known artists, no single database. So I spent a few years trying to build that database and then realized that I needed to try to share that information. I like to think that if I had gotten hit by a bus, no one would know about it. So that's how ArtGnome was born. I put out some articles initially just about this data and how it could help us fight forgery. But I quickly realized that I have a deep passion and love for writing about the intersection of art and tech. And that's evolved into my blog and these opportunities to speak on panels like this. I've done a lot of the early writing on blockchain and art and, pretty active in that community. And I think there's maybe some interesting things to say about that around shared infrastructure as well. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jason. And I think that some of the elements of what people were saying online when we were preparing for this panel was around NFTs and blockchain and how that could potentially change things for the art market. And I'm so grateful that you're here that we can kind of unpack that a little bit. So next, and I guess last but not least, I'd like to introduce Beichu Gonkar, who runs Art Represent. I met her quite a few years ago when one of her exhibitions was shortlisted for the Global Art Awards. And I heard about it and thought, wow, this is really an amazing organization, helping champion artists from conflict regions, but I'll let Beichu introduce that more. But since then, we've had a lot of discussions about narratives within art history and the canon and how you can change that discussion. And specifically, we even co-hosted a panel at the Association of Art History conference in Brighton about importing narratives and whose voice tells the story of an artist's work, and how often within museums especially, the work gets repositioned in a narrative that the curator chooses and maybe is not aligned with what the artist had envisaged themselves, or that someone from their region would have envisaged being. So thank you so much, Beichu, again for joining. And would you also introduce yourself, tell us how you got into the art market, art world?
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction and thank you for inviting me. It's been a really interesting kind of couple of years since I started Art Represent in 2015. And I think I sort of fell into the whole art tech kind of intersection through a series of serendipitous coincidences. I studied politics and international relations and then went on to study Chinese in Beijing. And after finishing my language degree, I wanted to stay on and work there. And someone introduced me to 79A, which is the art district there. And I started working for the museum, that's UCCA, and just kind of was taken aback by the role of art in China versus the role of art, in the UK where I grew up, and sort of the power of art in terms of its ability to navigate very, I think, delicate situations and how it communicates to people. And upon coming back to London, I started working up within the startup ecosystem, again, through an introduction through a friend. And I just felt like there had to be a merger of the two somehow. And I've always been fascinated by the ideas of representation around creation of narratives, around communication, who tells whose story in what way. And often, the very kind of singular and one-dimensional portrayal of communities, especially that are affected by conflict and oppression. Coming from one of those regions myself, I thought is there an infrastructure where artists from these regions can kind of access a more international audience and can be supported in a way that is not accessible to them where they are, and often they're in exile or, you know, in transit. And that's how I really came to start Art Represent in 2015. And since then, it's been an incredible journey. Of the 50 plus artists that I work with, I think I've only met 3 in person, of course, because everyone is everywhere and going to different places. And even, you know, this year, for example, has been so hard on everybody, but it's especially, I think, poignant to realize that, you know, I'm getting emails from artists in Venezuela saying the situation here is really dire. You know, can you somehow link me to other kind of, you know, sources and other kind of support systems and tools to navigate, you know, this particular difficult situation. And in that way, I think the conversation around a shared economy and sharing infrastructure is really interesting, especially when you're looking at what is available, you know, here in the West, quote unquote, or the global North, and versus, you know, areas where there isn't access to any kind of infrastructure at all in terms of supporting the artists.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I hope that everyone who is on this call today is starting to notice what the fabric is of this discussion and how there are many different dimensions to what we are going to discuss today. And each of our speakers are going to kind of represent a different part of the market, maybe not necessarily always only their opinion, but also the opinions of people that they work with that can then reflect the kind of different forces at play that are happening here. So to start off, I thought we would maybe take a moment to look at what the sharing economy is. If we look at the Investopedia definition that I shared in the reading room before this talk, it's about finding economic models that are peer-to-peer, which means that you're looking at person-to-person connections rather than needing someone in the middle. But it's kind of interesting that that is the concept, because there is someone in the middle. You've got a technology platform or a community on a technology platform that will be facilitating that. And I mean, a lot of the examples that people know today are things like Airbnb. That's the quintessential example of sharing resources and not having to have ownership of them to experience them. Do any of you want to provide an example of sharing economy platforms that you've seen working and how you think about the sharing economy? Jason, it looks like you might want to say something.
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting, as someone who's really interested in tech, you know, there are things like blockchain that I think people associate with a sharing economy. But one of the things that I've noticed is that there is no technology that inherently makes things sharing. It's really a community thing. It's as much a human thing as it is a technology thing. So I know in watching the evolution of artists and communities of artists growing around blockchain, in the early days, there were a lot of sharing-oriented projects that were more experimental. I think about things like Dada NYC and Bea Ramos, who has this platform where artists from all over the world can draw together. I think, you know, maybe the world's largest collaborative arts drawing platform, really something new and exciting. And she's worked really hard on trying to build a new economy, experimental economy, where when an artist sells a work, the profits actually get distributed across all the artists in the community. And I think that is pretty radical, but also the kind of experimentation that needs to be done. And while the blockchain helps enable that, you know, it took someone like Bea to actually make it, you know, more of a shared infrastructure in that sense. And then on another level, all these blockchain things, you know, projects are sort of built on Ethereum or the Bitcoin blockchain, which is another layer of sharing. I think CryptoPunks is another early one that folks talk about, where two artists, Matt and John, actually put out 10,000 of these artworks and gave away 9,000. So talk about sharing. And just an emergent economy grew up and around those images. And again, it was blockchain enabled, but I think it was the intelligent and intentional use of the technology that made it, you know, a sharing economy. if that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect. And actually, one of the interesting things there is it's very much about the individuals that facilitated that and that also are participating in that community. But you could also have business to business sharing economy examples, like co-working, for example, is a way of sharing resources that might not necessarily have been done before. Beichu, Louise, have you come across co-working examples that you've seen working well?
I think it's interesting what Jason said around this idea of, it being really about the community and technology being a tool that enables that sharing, to be scaled or to be transformed in a different way. I think in the context that where I work with a lot of these artist communities, it's interesting to see that sharing economy happening physically, kind of in real life, where it's a small group, they all know each other, they share resources, both in terms of actual materials sometimes, as well as resources and connections to, funding, to gallerists, to other platforms, etc. And then we work with organizations that are on the ground, and not even necessarily arts organizations, but perhaps NGOs or charities, where they're also supporting that cultural infrastructure in a way. And it's been kind of a working model, I think, also between us, where we've tried to create some kind of a shared economy that brings that offline community online, where we then both kind of share technological platforms with these institutions as well as these artists, but we've also been working around revenue sharing models as well, where then we can all sort of benefit from this model, which has been, I think, really interesting. And perhaps there's been more flexibility and freedom to do that in pockets of the world where there isn't such a set kind of way of how the market should operate.
So kind of, if you have like the ground hasn't been built on, it's easier to build the house than to rebuild the house that's already there. Yeah. Louise, what were you going to say?
I guess really from an art market perspective, I think probably one of the shining examples, and this actually predates COVID, is Vanessa Carlos's initiative called Condo, which is a simple concept of pooling resources, sharing resources and gallery spaces, maybe for sort of younger, more emerging gallerists to be able to travel and co-curate exhibitions and go to other spaces and other cities. So I think she set this up she's run this a couple of years in London, New York, I think also now in Sao Paulo, Mexico City and Shanghai. And where you're not a mega gallery and you have outposts in every single city, this is a great opportunity to pool resources and work collects. This example predates COVID, which I think is quite interesting.
And there might be more examples coming out now because of the 2020.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is, as I say, it's a pre-COVID initiative, but I can see a lot more of this happening, and Condo or versions of Condo really being encouraged. And I think, so the other side that I've seen that's been very well documented has been during lockdown, has been how the London art community have come together. There's been a very well documented WhatsApp group where all the galleries have worked together in terms of sharing resources and information on how to ultimately restart their business after lockdown. All the health and safety, all the new rules that they had to navigate in order just to simply reopen their gallery again. And out of that, you've then seen other initiatives like the London Collective online, which I think is hosted by Vortic. And another initiative that I thought was really impressive is Art Power Hong Kong, which again was an online response. So it's an online website. And the concept really was around the time, I think, when Art Basel Hong Kong was cancelled, there was very quick mobilization to all work together. And I think now there's about 155 partners all online. And so it's a great collaboration where you see all the different organizations, commercial and non-commercial, partnering together to create one online site where kind of all the content is aggregated. You can read about artists, exhibitions, content. And that's, I think, pretty powerful.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that you were thinking about with Art Mavens as well, right? Is bringing things together so you can be in the same place. Similar
ideas of bringing those different communities within the art world together.
It's interesting because I guess the potential for the show, I guess what I'd love to focus on in this discussion is a bit about what are the blockers and what are the things that are not being shared right now that could potentially make the art market better or worse if they did happen. And if, because in many ways, if I speak to others, they feel that the art market is a bit behind. It's much more siloed still. It's not adopted a lot of the technological solutions. Really, only in recent times have people started building online viewing platforms, some people call them OVRs, where you can see the work on a website, which is basically something from not really that new technology, but people have phrased it differently. Jason, I see you smiling about that. What do you think of OVRs?
Yeah, I was going to talk a bit about the barriers, but OVRs do make me laugh. I think everything has been rebranded since COVID. So, when it first hit, I had a client who was like, we're going to have an online conference. And I was like, you mean a webinar? And they're like, don't call it a webinar. It's an online. And I think it's the same with these OVRs, which are pretty much websites, and some of the better known galleries will put like a plant or a couch next to an image.
So you get an idea of scale. Yeah.
Yeah. Like that was the part that we were all missing. So the innovation is that we've got this plant. I mean, it would be cool, with all the things that we can do with tech, if people pushed a little bit further. And there's, some of that. I don't actually have great examples, and I wish there were more, and maybe we'll get there. I think we're at that stage where we're trying to recreate the physical world in the digital still, which, happens in a lot of evolution. And, I think we'll eventually get over that. But barrier wise, I think there's sort of a deficit of, attention, support, resources, and funding. And I think that in the arts, and I think that that's what causes people to get competitive and be selfish and not want to share as much. And I see that across the sort of the subcultures that I travel in. I think early days for blockchain, when it was all for fun, people were more likely to share. And then as soon as it started to become somewhat successful, people start to pull back a little bit and get competitive. Similar with the generative art community, which I think is a great model for sharing. So generative art is art based on software, and the community has always been really big around open sourcing your code, right? So we've all learned from each other how to do programming.
And open sourcing, what exactly did that mean again?
Yeah, open source, you talk about sharing in architectures, open source is this ethos or philosophy that you should make all your code available for free online for everyone else to learn from. And even beyond that, the communities online that will go in and explain to you how they did what they did so that you can learn from them. And it's really because that's how most, other people have learned. So, there's several generations of programmers and generative artists now that have learned this way. And it's largely still that way. But even in the last year or two, we're starting to see some of these generative artists take off a little bit in the nascent art market. And it's not having the greatest effect. I'm starting to see that people now, again, that there's a chance that these things could actually be worth some money. People are a little bit more hesitant to share their code, right? When the money comes in. And then, the last example that sort of comes from my weird world of subcultures is the art data space. I've gone to a few conferences where I've talked to other folks that have sort of companies / hobbies somewhere in between around art and art data. And we all, over coffee, talk about how we're all doing the same boring, laborious tasks of cleaning all of this data and gathering this data and how we should all share. But I think everyone thinks in the back of their head that there's somehow a way to monetize that data. So, I think the barrier to answer, or at least to give my impression on what the barrier is that bizarrely, as these things become more successful, because there's a shortage of resources and funding, people actually get a little bit tighter and are less likely to share.
And Louise, you're nodding. Do you have other thoughts on why Why are people so protective? Why are there these silos in the art market?
I guess ultimately we're working and living in an art market. It is a capitalist culture. Yeah. And I hate to say it, but I think everybody's revenues right now are really pulled. You know, everybody is squeezed. And so I agree with Jason. I think everybody's going to be protective about revenues. And I think as an art market observer, that's what maybe we don't see. We hear about shared resources and pooled resources. And I think that's where we ultimately will see the market move to, is thinking about how to work collaboratively to share costs. But I'm not sure about the revenue side. I'm not sure we're going to see necessarily that switch or that degree of transparency. We're certainly seeing more transparency in terms of the OVRs. We're definitely seeing more transparency in terms of the OVRs, online viewing rooms, and pricing.
You mean it's mainly pricing transparency, right? Because they're still behind a password. You have VIP. Exactly.
But we're seeing more pricing transparency. There's more data transparency and pricing transparency through organizations like ArtNet, which is great. But understanding how the revenue plays out and whether there is a possibility of revenue sharing, I think that's a huge conundrum for the art market.
Well, really interesting. And I think that we'll move into showing our slides, because we actually did a poll about this before this talk. Beichu, did you want to mention anything else about barriers that you've noticed before we move on to the slides about the poll that we did?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think in terms of barrier, there might also be a barrier of perception as well as the reality of the resources and revenues available. I think with, say, Uber or Airbnb, they seem to be models that are incredibly scalable because it can be replicated across different countries according to the needs that we all share. I think in some ways there are growing communities of art collectors around the world, but there seems to be a disconnect somehow, and perhaps that is due to a technological barrier where they are not able to access or even to sort of realize that there are these kind of these different markets that are working in silos that can perhaps be combined in some way. And I think cost sharing is definitely one way to kind of tackle that. But the other thing I would say is, a kind of more sort of a more united sense of exhibiting art, exposing art. A lot of artists are actually not known. A lot of art markets are, not on the sort of public radar or within the public discourse. And I think actually by opening those channels up, more revenues and more resources are available, but there is a barrier perception as well as perhaps a technological one that's stopping us from doing that.
And actually, that's an interesting one. Before we go to our slide, I was just thinking, before we had this call, we talked a little bit about that weird balance between being protective and making sure people don't see stuff. So having things in free ports and having things hidden away, versus you also need exposure, right? Because you need to have this, you need to be famous to be valuable to a certain extent in the art market. And I think there are different elements there. Who would like to start talking about this duality? Jason, you're very into scarcity as a concept, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll always talk about anything, so you have to make sure you cut me off when I talk too long. But there's a bit of a battle in the digital art world around scarcity versus abundance and what those things mean. And I'm a believer, especially now since COVID, where we're all communicating digitally and our friend groups and our social groups are much more online, that it's really exposure of images and artworks that actually drive up the value, which is quite a different concept. So a couple, 100 years ago, if you owned a painting and it was in your castle and, it showed that you were had some power or wealth, and only the people that came in could see it. And that's where it derived its value. But where we are now, the more people that can see that you own something, or if you're the artist, the more people that see your work, the more relevant it is and the more its value goes up. And I think you don't have to look too much further than the marketing campaigns at Christie's and Sotheby's, where they put tens of thousands of dollars, into these campaigns to make sure we see these super expensive paintings that can sell for, tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. They know most of us can't buy those, right? So why flood all of our screens with those images? Because it drives up the value and increases the cultural relevance, right? So I think one of the neat things in the blockchain art world is that we talk about how everyone sees it, but only one owns it, right? So this idea that you don't have to hold back the artwork from other people seeing it. In fact, we all become sort of pro-sharing and want people to see the work because it drives up the value for the artist and for the collector. But because of the decentralized ledger, everyone knows that only one person can own it. Of course, a lot of people think that's nonsense. They're like, how can you own something if everyone sees it for free? But we've had that with museums for a long time, right? I mean, just because someone puts their work in the museum and everyone can see it doesn't mean it's not valuable. Again, I think people do that because it increases the value culturally and potentially financially.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and clearly, in my day job, I do a lot with this kind of exposure with museums, etc. And I think, Bechi, that's one of the things that we were talking about a lot, is like what museums choose to show has such an impact on what becomes valuable, but you almost have to play hard to get to the museums. You can't go up and be like, hey, I really want you to show this work, but you also want to show that you're enthusiastic. And for artists that are coming from conflict regions that maybe don't have friends who are a curator or don't know that person at MoMA, how do they even get recognition, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think in the discussion that we had previously, we talked about this interesting dilemma between being unknown and being scarce. And often working with these artists, their work is scarce in that they are in situations where they are not producing huge amounts of art, or the communities of artists are limited. Yet, because they are unknown, the value of their work is not, being seen perhaps in the same way as scarcity, would assume, say, in the European context or in the American context. And, I remember one of the artists that I work with said to me, when you go to a big museum and, the museums are selling posters of, famous artists' work replicas, they're being sold for cheap and everyone is buying them and, they're making money from it. So why is my gallerist, or why is the dealer that I'm working with telling me not to do that, right? And I thought that really was exemplary of this idea that, when something is deemed as being good, or when something is deemed as being worthy, I think it almost creates more opportunity and more freedom for that particular artist or for that particular institution to then benefit from, maybe a sharing economy, or benefit from, things like producing multiples. Whereas when you're unknown or unexposed, doing that, although it would help you sustain a livelihood, it would then somehow damage your reputation or your status as an artist. And I think maybe, there's some work to be done there as well in terms of how we, value and view these things, and who says or what says, something is worthwhile.
Well, and that's an interesting point, because both Louise and Jason, you both studied art history, as did I, and the works that we study in the typical art historical narrative are actually the ones that have been reproduced a lot. So the ones that were in The Lives of the Artists by Vastari, or the ones that were mentioned by what's his name, Gombrich, in The History of Art. I mean, those are the artists that then we decide to go back to, and it's because their images have been reproduced. But somehow, because the images weren't as exactly the same as the images that, so you were reproducing it on a lino print or a black and white photograph, it somehow was more acceptable. But as the reproduction technology is getting better and better, there's almost like a uncomfortableness about that, isn't there?
Yeah, you mean about the value escaping because the copy isn't sufficiently different from the original? So there's a sense that we want to have something better than someone else. And if ours, it's like Andy Warhol's comment about why he loves Coke, right? Because the poorest person and the richest person drink the same Coke. You can't get a better Coke, right? And I think there is a sense that you want to own something that someone else doesn't have as part of this. But I think we can change that, and I'm starting to see that shift a little bit. There's always this desire to show that you've got something scarce, unique, and original, but there's a different kind of fun that comes with co-owning something, or, knowing that you've invested in something that's valuable to you because it shows that you're part of a community.
Yeah.
Not to bring it to like the more commercial side of like something as what could seem as frivolous as sneakers, but I think when you buy a sneaker like the Air Jordan, the reason why it's cool isn't because it's the only one. It's because lots of other cool people have them, right? So I think, maybe in the digital market where you can have endless editions, they're still trying to figure out how many to make, but having some sort of cap on it, but enough that people can afford to participate, sort of expanding who can collect.
Well, it's interesting because that cool kid who owns it that then makes you want to have one too, it's the same with museums, right? If they own one of your works, then suddenly you want to have it too. And artists create this type of dynamic with museums. I think we could keep talking, but I'm going to bring the slides up now because I want to show what everyone else was thinking. So what we did on Twitter and LinkedIn was we shared a poll that asked whether what would be most difficult for the art world to share, and if we add up the votes, the two things that were most expected to be difficult for the art world to share were revenues and access to resources. So both of those are very much about this kind of kind of looking at the capitalist system behind the art market and that type of thing. And if we look at the next slide, there's also revenues were the number one answer on LinkedIn, where we could only put less options, so we put 4. I guess we've already sort of touched on the fact that revenues are difficult for the art world to share, but the truth is I was a bit surprised about that answer, because there are many examples of things, the art world sharing revenues. I mean, someone in the Q&A mentioned the artist support pledge, where when you buy a work, you also, I guess also there's, so the artist support pledge is one way of supporting artists. The other is that there are things like the artist resale right, where a part of the revenues are going back to the artists. Were you also surprised about revenues being number one, Louise? I saw you nodding.
Yeah, I think it's, I just think it's indicative of the climate right now.
I see.
I think probably if these questions were asked 6 months ago, it might be different. It might be networks.
Interesting.
I think some of those networks are now much more open to being shared. I think revenues, it's just where we are all, as a collective global community, unless you're Jeff Bezos right now, quite frankly. I mean, we're all going professionally and personally. We're going through our bank accounts. What subscriptions? What maybe things? What can we do in order to sort of tighten those purse strings? So I think right here, right now, I'm not surprised with that. I think, and not only if you think about it from a business perspective in terms of revenues, it's also just thinking about as an art business or organization, planning ahead. And I think that's the problem right now, is that the future is so uncertain, because I think even when we went back to the original lockdown, when we started thinking ahead, we thought maybe by September or October or November, I know gallerists were thinking perhaps they could go back, there would be FIAC, maybe Art Basel, maybe Beach. It's very hard at this stage to plan. So revenues are front and center of everyone's thinking, I think, right now.
Interesting, but I guess, revenues are hard to get, but are they hard to share? Are they, is it then, yeah.
I think we might get to that point, but yeah. I think because it's front and center of everyone's thoughts, yes, hopefully now, if there's a way to rethink the model and restart the model, I think it's now.
Yeah. Beichu, I mean, even with Art Represent, you're looking at ways in which the artists support each other, and also it's a non-profit, so you raise donations as well. What was your reaction when you saw the revenues as being number one for the art world?
I mean, I think similarly to what Louise is saying, I think it's front and center of everyone's mind. So I think it seems like the most kind of obvious thing where you feel like revenue sharing isn't happening. I actually think that, I think by thinking more flexibly around like monetization models and business models, revenue sharing can be, I think, actually more accessible than say like something else like technology, for example, as an obstacle. But with us, the way that we've worked is we're very transparent about the commission that we take from the work sold, which we do as a non-profit, and that's with the understanding that then artists will get the opportunity to showcase their work or to, you know, stage creative projects, which would be then funded by the commission that we take. And it's been, I think, fascinating to see the artists supporting each other, even though they're coming from, you know, different ends of the world, and also to see a sharing in terms of their common experience as well as common obstacles. So that's been, I think, a very kind of fascinating process for us. And now we're looking at maybe a franchising model where we can then create a toolkit, which we're working on, that includes shared resources, both in terms of contact, funding, legal support, administrative support, you know, all of the things that I think are not taught to artists at art school about how to be an artist, which is counterintuitive sometimes. And of course, artists should be spending their time creating the work, but within the reality of the market that we work in and the system in which they have to operate, these are fundamental aspects of, you know, building a career. So I think, yeah, in that way, it's about, you know, kind of maybe growing, thinking from other sectors and applying it to our particular industry and being more flexible around how we both monetize, but also then share that monetization, share the revenue, costs, etc. And I think revenue then inevitably leads to other types of resources. And I do think that there is abundance to be created, but I think there has to be an element of vulnerability, which I'm not sure everyone is comfortable with.
I'm looking around to see if anyone wanted to follow up on that. I think one interesting point you mentioned about what you said about artists and your relationship with the artists is that in theory galleries should have that same relationship with the artists too, right? So they take a percentage of the income from the sale, and they're reinvesting it into the artist's work and into researching the artists and everything. And I feel that might not be completely transparent, but I would consider that revenue sharing, and on a level that is quite sophisticated, really. Would you agree?
Some of our artists as well, you know, it's beyond the community that we have, is that some of the artists, they have, you know, there might be a computer scientist or a graphic designer, so they have a day job, you know, where they support themselves and their families. So then the revenue they get from their artwork, they use to then support younger artists in the communities where they come from. And that for me is kind of an expanding sense of a sharing economy that I think is really wonderful. And I think also in terms of, you know, that idea of scarcity and unknown, but also with sharing and with protection, the way that we work is that we don't hold the artists exclusive to our platform. I think for us, it benefits our entire community when those artists get to go out and do lots of different things with lots of different people. And you see it sort of coming around back to your community where you started by offering them that springboard. And I think sometimes by holding the artist to, you know, an exclusivity of, you know, belonging just to one gallery or just to one particular institution can be damaging both for the artist but also for the gallery and the system as a whole, because as Jason was saying, exposure now and, you know, that sense of being seen and being known is adding value and driving value, both, in terms of the monetary as well as culturally. And I think by allowing artists to be out there and to be across multiple platforms drives up that exposure, which then again creates a sense of abundance for everybody who's within the system.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Tim Schneider wrote about that in ArtNet as well, that with athletes, when they kind of get better, you still honor the scout that got them in the first place, and they earn a bit on that person who does so well. And I think that's the model that you're describing, but a lot of times once they get to the mega galleries, that doesn't happen anymore, right? They jump ship, and that scout, those people who helped in the beginning, are not necessarily remunerated anymore. Maybe that's another way in which revenues are not being shared. Yeah. I guess moving on from revenues, Louise, you mentioned networks, and I was thinking about it as well, because when I think about what the art world might be good at sharing, I thought it might be networks, because if you look at an art fair, galleries pay to be there and invite their people, but the people walk around and meet other galleries, so that's kind of sharing networks. But you said that maybe they would be reluctant to share networks. What do you think? How does that fine balance work?
It's an interesting dichotomy, isn't it? It really is. Because when you're at a fair, you're right, you have an interaction with a particular client, and they could, of course, then go and visit another stand and purchase another artwork.
Yeah.
It's really tough. It's really tough. And I think, again, probably through lockdown, because I guess the art market isn't on that perpetual treadmill, they've had to kind of rethink their networks and maybe consolidate those networks. So I've heard quite a lot. I mean, gallerists have more time on their hands. They've been able to perhaps engage with collectors on a slightly different level. Some of those collectors, I think, have been more open to longer conversations, a greater focus, perhaps more towards connoisseurship. But it is a really interesting one, because I think ultimately, in the art market, everyone's protective of their network, their little kind of black book of contacts. And yet you go into a fair scenario where you kind of have to open that up and share that with your peer group.
And Jason, what about, you're very involved with the digital art scene. Are collectors in the digital art scene, are people protective of like the big collector of digital art that they're working with, or are they actually trying to get people to buy things from different things? And has it really gotten to that point?
Yeah, so I would say, as there's been more and more money coming into the scene. So ironically, in 2020, with everyone stuck at home, the digital art scene and buying digital art has exploded, while the rest of the art world has actually contracted quite a bit. I'd say we're still at a stage where artists are actually supporting other artists quite a bit, and introducing each other to other collectors. So there's this idea when we talk about the sharing economy or shared infrastructure and networks. I think they're savvy in that they're promoting each other, and they realize that raises everybody up sort of together, So I don't see that protectionism, but also to be fair, as someone who's a little bit of an outsider in the traditional art world, I've always been surprised at how generous folks like yourself, Bernadine, and others have been in making introductions for me. I know I'm not really on the buying and selling side for a lot of these works, and I think that's probably the theme here, I think, is the closer we get to revenues and money, the more protective people are, regardless of what it is. But, I'm excited about what I see in the culture in terms of folks trying to help each other, get exposure on the digital side.
That's an interesting point. And actually, one example I wanted to bring up was about education and access to those networks of kind of, we talked about the courtauld and studying at universities and those types of things. Not everyone around the world can attend the courtauld. one person I know, João Correia from Brazil, he actually was attending a master's degree in London at the Royal Academy, and then helping share some of those learnings with people in Brazil, where he's from, that would never be able to attend that master's degree in London, and kind of seeing that as his way of sharing. But you could say that, is he then undermining the income that the university could get? But actually, you're raising awareness. I think it's an interesting parallel to the art itself, also the knowledge about the art. Jason, you unmuted yourself.
Oh, sorry.
No, I mean, I thought that meant that you wanted to say something. No?
Yeah. I don't know that I have as much to add to that one, but...
Okay. Then Louise, I saw that you also were going to say something about that.
I mean, I advocate for this hugely, just in terms of, I'd love to see more mentorship, more continuing professional development across the industry. I think at the moment, I feel the group perhaps within the art professional community, and maybe the group that have left university, who are kind of 2 or 3 years on into their career, but maybe don't have those established networks. So they've started that learning journey, but now suddenly are thrown into a kind of work from home scenario where they're not able to kind of have the day to day, that general kind of, mentoring that you get on a day to day basis. And so that's the area that I'm kind of trying to sort of focus in on at the moment, and see if